This podcast is brought to you by lineupmedia.fm.
Because if you can tell me what your habits are, I can tell you what sort of a person you are. I can tell you what your future looks like.
But like I always say, life is 10% what happens to you, it's 90% what you do about it.
The people who are most effective in the workplace believe that their future is going to be bigger than their past. When people don't believe that their future is going to be bigger than their past, they begin to disengage.
You're listening to The Circuit of Success, a podcast dedicated to helping you achieve success in every facet of life. Only on the lineupmedia.fm podcast network. Now, your host, Brett Gilliland.
Welcome to the Circuit of Success. I'm your host, Brett Gilliland, and I've got Ben Ahrens with me. Ben, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well, Brett. Thanks so much for having me on. It's good to see you.
It's great to have you. It's you got an unbelievable story, so we're excited to dive into that. You're calling from Long Island, New York. We were just talking about hopefully spring is in the air. As I look out, it's around almost 50 degrees here. Going to be 60 or 70 by the end of the week, so that's good. How's New York City treating you?
Getting there, not quite as warm as where you are, but we're getting above freezing, which is a good milestone for this time of the year.
Heading in the right direction.
Exactly.
Well, I know you were very passionate about healing and recovery and human optimization. We're going to talk about that in your deal, Reorigin, in a little bit. But just like on every show, you know, Ben, we like to talk about what's made you the man you are today. You've obviously got a great story and a great message to share today, but just kind of want to learn a little bit of the background and what's made you the man you are today.
Yeah, sure. You know, I heard you ask this question to someone else on the podcast, and it really kind of got my wheels turning. And the kind of answer that came up for me was curiosity, was just kind of the continued desire or happening to follow my curiosity wherever it leads.
And so when you think about that, like, did you learn that from parents? I mean, was that a family thing? Like, what was it about the curiosity thing that drove you?
Yeah, good question. I would say it might be kind of 50-50. I think some of it was just innate. I remember from a really early age, just being one of those kids that, took my mom's phone apart. I once pulled the windshield wipers off my dad's car and tried to make a little robot out of them. So I always had this kind of curiosity to seek out how things worked and what I could kind of like take apart and put back together. And then I do think probably my parents played a role. They were both, independent workers. My mother was an actress, Broadway theater, and my father was a writer. So they definitely encouraged my sister and I to kind of run with that curiosity a little bit and explore different options, which was great.
You know, I was shocked when, you hear about Broadway all the time in New York, and then you go there for the first time. And I was picturing these massive theaters and all this stuff. I was surprised at how little they are, which is, I think, awesome. It's really cool and more intimate. Oh,
definitely. And yeah, there's a, good variety of them, but certainly if you go there with in your mind that this big majestic opera house or something, and you go and you're in this tiny little cramped seating area where the seats are really tightly packed together, it's a little bit different probably from what most people have in mind.
Yeah. Well, in St. Louis, we're lucky. We have the Fox Theater, and it's an amazing theater. And, they bring the Broadway shows through town throughout the year. And so I had this thing in my mind that was going to be that. And then it was like, 25 rows, and that was it. I'm like, this is cool. Totally different. What show was your mom in any big shows?
She was initially. Yeah. This was going back before my sister and I were even born, but she was in Crazy for You, Guys and Dolls.
Oh, wow.
A few others that anyone who's into Broadway shows would probably recognize.
That's awesome. That's very cool. So tell us a little about your background, man. I know you've traveled the world and you've, really literally all over the world, and you're studying human performance and what are the boundaries of our potential, all that kind of stuff. But when you think about it, kind of tell us your story and kind of what's gotten you on this mission now. I know you had what you call the miraculous recovery. And so could you talk to us about that?
Yeah. So, basically, as I mentioned, I was really into just figuring out and understanding how things work. And so one of the things I became fascinated with early on, I'd say in high school, was the human body and the human being and how we could change. It came out of a kind of egoistic place of being a scrawny kid wanting to change my persona and physique, and getting into working out and Arnold Schwarzenegger and all this kind of stuff. And but beyond what I was trying to portray or put out there, I remember just becoming really fascinated with this notion that I could go from having a thought in my head, like changing having a vision of myself, and then taking specific actions, in this case, working out, doing specific exercises, sets and reps. And then after just the passage of time, I would start to see physical changes in the real world, in my body, and how the world responded to me and everything. And it just became this really fascinating thing that I got deeper into. As I got into college, I studied physiology and started doing athletic training and corrective exercise for some of the athletes there, and led to my first career post-college as a trainer in Manhattan. I was also still into my own types of athletics as a surfer and someone who had a summer surf camp in Long Island. And I just loved how I could affect these changes, not only in myself, but other people. Then around that time, when I was 25, I encountered a challenging situation that was, potentially one of the most embarrassing things that could happen to someone trying to make a name and career for themselves in health and fitness, which is that I completely lost my health. I went from literally being this, healthy kind of beacon of athleticism, who was, as you noted, traveling the world. I was surfing, and then training clients in the winter and having this summer surf camp and everything. From that to pretty much overnight being bedbound and having a wide range of physical and neurological problems, and all of these different things, from joint pain, muscle pain, fatigue, inability to read or see clearly, brain fog, really came upon me quite dramatically. And this led to what turned out to be, several years, about 3 years stint in bed while I was trying to figure out and untangle these complications. So I can go into more of the details.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think? What was at the root of the cause? I mean, you think about that. You said overnight, but I assume it didn't. Yeah. Maybe it did. I shouldn't ever assume, but I'm assuming there were choices that were leading up to that happened so quickly, or was it literally it just happened overnight?
So on the surface of it, it happened overnight. And as I started to go to different doctors and get tested and all these different types of things, what was uncovered was Lyme disease, which is an unfortunately common problem in the Northeast where I am. A lot of people have, comes transmitted through a tick. It's a bacterial infection, usually combined with other co-infections. And some percentage of people, I happen to be one of those, can get severely devastated by it. It can become chronic, meaning it can cross the blood-brain barrier and basically create all of these different symptoms that don't seem to stop even when that initial infection subsides. So, I noted that on the surface, this is what was happening. It was the Lyme disease. But over the years, as I got deeper into understanding my own condition for the sake of recovering my health, I realized that the human being, the human body, is far more complex than simple cause and effect. And one of the challenges for anyone who's dealing with a chronic condition, whether it feels more emotional, psychological, like anxiety or depression, or whether it's more physical, like mine was certainly a combination of both, with the brain fog and neurological symptoms, but also all of these acute bodily symptoms and things like juvenile rheumatoid arthritis and pains and things like that. For anyone who's been through one of these types of conditions, they know that it seems to be far more complicated than just a singular cause that could cause all these things. So in retrospect, I like to say, maybe the tick bite or the infection was the straw that broke the camel's back, but the camel's back might not have broken if it wasn't already carrying such a heavy load. And so, of course, working in the way I was, there was a lot of kind of burnout. I was already in this sort of adrenally fatigued state, a lot of just overturning and overworking the system. And that made it, I think, possible for this little tiny tick to come along and essentially kind of short circuit the system. And the interesting part is that as I learn more about this condition, particularly why the symptoms were persisting beyond the point where I was treated and years later even, I started to make my way to the brain and the neurological connection. And essentially what I learned there was that the brain has a particular kind of memory for certain traumatic events. And this was actually written about very recently in an article in Scientific American. I think the title was actually "The Brain Has a Particular Memory for Viruses." That article was mostly about long COVID, but it bears a lot of similarities to chronic fatigue syndrome, even things like anxiety and depression, whereby essentially what can happen, as the hypothesis goes, is that when a person is already in a state of being run down, they're in a low state, and then they have an acute trauma or infection or even an injury, like a bodily injury, what can happen is the brain, in a very sensitive position during that time, can effectively learn to overprotect the body. And that overprotection leads to inflammation, leads to all of these different processes that are necessary in the acute phase for healing. Like if you catch a cold, you want to have your immune system react to it. You want to have an inflammatory process there, but you don't want that inflammatory process to continue 6 months or 6 years after the cold has passed, right? So what was once or started out as an appropriate response to an aggressor, because the body is perhaps already in this hypervigilant state, the brain can essentially learn that this is how you should react all the time, even to the little slightest symptom or feeling. And undoing that problem, that's kind of where the next chapter took me, is now, okay, figuring out that this is going on in my system. How do you then update the brain's information to know that it actually doesn't need to continue to produce this inflammatory response?
Yeah. And so what did you find out that, so let's take that to today, and you're helping people and we're helping people, and lots of successful individuals are listening to this. Like what advice would you have for us on how to stay away from that, like the brain fog, the anxiety, the whatever it may be that people are struggling with today? What are some, like what I would call peak performance habits that we can start doing daily, like right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think the number one thing is to avoid getting yourself into that scenario. And that's done just through realization, through realizing that we are, as human beings, we are not meant to just perpetually exert ourselves. We have a sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight, or that sort of go-go action-oriented system. And we have a parasympathetic nervous system. You can think of parasympathetic as in the word parachute, meaning that it's meant to slow you down. So one of the things that we can do, of course, is honor this polarity, this rhythm, and do things on a regular basis. And I'm speaking to myself as much as anyone else here, as someone who obviously learned this lesson the hard way. It still needs to be reminded that we have to incorporate into our daily life these types of practices that will help us go deeper into recovery. So obviously things like good sleep are the obvious ones, but excuse me. Also doing things just that bring us joy on an everyday basis, whether it's going for a walk, interrupting a pattern of exertion where we feel like we're working too hard, just installing these little brief moments throughout the day that can allow us to recharge and rejuvenate are so simple, but these are the kinds of things that we tend to sweep under the rug for too long.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm just taking a note here on this, but I think, so I wear a Whoop bracelet or whatever you want to call this thing. And it talks about that, sympathetic versus parasympathetic, the fight or flight. To your point, I like that parachute, slow down, right? Take care of ourselves. And I think so many times as leaders, we want to go faster because we think that's going to be more efficient. What I like to talk about is you got to slow down so you can speed up. And so when you hear that, like, how do you slow down? How do you create more joy in your day when, a lot of people are running and gunning and you're raising kids and your business and all these things? It sometimes can feel selfish to say, I'm going to slow down and have some joy at, 1:00 this afternoon. What are you doing for that?
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to say that there are these two mechanisms. It's important to understand that stress is not inherently bad. there's always two sides to the coin. Like, a common cold is not necessarily bad. And we even know, statistically speaking, that if a cold virus breezes through a room of 10 people, 3 of them will get sick and exhibit symptoms, while the other 7 say do not. And the reason is because it's never just what's coming at us from the environment, the stress or the pathogen or the trigger. It's also how and why our bodies respond to it. So when it comes to stress, there are these 2 different types of, generally speaking, stress responses. One of them is what we know as the threat response. This is what activates that sympathetic nervous system, usually leads to increases in adrenaline and cortisol and epinephrine, and sometimes goes into that inflammatory cascade if it's not turned off in a timely fashion. But the other type of threat response is what's known as a challenge response. Now, the challenge response, like the threat response, will have similar effects in that it could raise your heart rate, it could give you energy. The difference is that it changes your physiology in such a way where it actually allows you to become more efficient with your energy. So you can think of it as like the flow state, right? When you drop into a flow state, you become incredibly focused. You're still working, being productive, but rather than being scattered and working in this really kind of hectic way where we're more reactive, you can actually really zone into what you're doing. So as it comes to answering your question, those breaks or like inserting, certain bits of recovery throughout the day don't even necessarily need to look like stopping completely what you're doing and going and having a nap. Of course, if you can fit that into your day, by all means, I'd say, give it a shot. But something as subtle as changing our mindset around the activity or structuring our day in a way that supports more flow, where we perceive the task at hand as, this is a challenge that's going to strengthen me, or something that I can even use to get into that flow state. Simply the act of what's called cognitive reappraisal, or thinking about it in that way, we know actually changes your physiology to a way that can actually energize us and rejuvenate us as we're doing the work. So it's not really either or. It can actually be simply the way we're interfacing with the challenges throughout our day.
Yeah. And I do think what I said earlier too, that slowing down to speed up. I know for me, I like to put gaps in my calendar too, so I can, shut my door and just kind of take a deep breath and then think about the rest of the day. Right. I think that's really, really important. And for me, it's, it's my daily planner and the things that I go through in my journal is, I think, with more clarity, that's how you can start to master your week, master your time and all that stuff. There's only 24 hours in a day, right? So we have to be able to manage it to the best of our ability. And for me, I think it's planning that comes back to that. So what topics would you say for somebody today, if you could implement 1 or 2 key things into their day that would be a game changer, like an absolute game changer, what would that be?
Yeah. So I would say, let's start with the kind of bottom up approach, meaning like controlling your environment, which is easier than controlling yourself. So the 3 things I would say, and again, starting with the bottom, starting with the environment, is I'll take a page from your book here or from my own, which is planning, right? Planning your day. So the first thing is creating order out of chaos. And I've got my, time block planner here, which is a method I like because, as you rightly noted, there's a finite amount of time in the day, and our to-do lists sometimes seem to exceed that amount. But simply realizing that you can only actually do one thing at a time. When you plan it out or you block it out, it kind of enables you to really zone into that one thing, to not be distracted. Stress really comes from, or at least that threat response, as opposed to the challenge response, comes from wanting to be in 2 places at one time, right? It comes from, I know I have to get this task done, but I'm getting all these emails, or I really want to be with my family, or, but I also know I have to get all this stuff done. And it's that gap between where we are and where we want to be that creates stress. The wider the gap, the bigger the stress response or the threat response. So to get into that challenge zone, that challenge response, it's to really commit to being present with the task at hand, to setting that one thing at a time that we're going to do. So that would be the number one thing I would say is acknowledging our sort of limitation and accounting for that by blocking it out and planning. The number 2 thing, and this also goes off of something you were saying, is actually slowing down. as you're working. Sometimes it can feel like we are just spinning the wheels, right? And kind of slipping on ice. We're not actually making contact with the ground and able to make that smooth forward motion that we need to make in order to feel like we're really progressing. So once you have your to-do list plotted out, or you know what the thing is that you're going to be working on, one thing I actually like to have people practice is doing that one thing at a 50% reduced speed than they normally would, even if it's like typing an email. And there's actually a lot of interesting evidence and research to show that when you slow your nervous system down in this way, it enables you to engage in a much higher level. And the military has that saying, slow is smooth, and smooth is fast, right? NASCAR drivers, same thing. In MotoGP, they say the fastest guys have the slowest hands. And the reason is because they have that smooth connection to the nervous system. So we want to maintain that connection. And one of the ways to do that is by really dropping in and slowing down. And then the third thing is kind of cycling back to the first thing I noted, which is more of a mindset thing. So, now that you have your, what am I going to focus on? How am I going to do it singularly, slowly, smoothly? The third thing would be about the mindset, and really thinking that when things do get overwhelming, when things do feel like, okay, it is that too much, to just reframe to yourself that this is a challenge. This is actually going to make you stronger. And by kind of taking the emphasis off of the outcome and placing it on the process, this is what's known as like the growth mindset, right? That enables us to shift our physiology from that threat response, which is very scattered, to the challenge response, which is very focused.
And I saw on here too, my preparation says, when you learn to access the control panel of your mind, the potential for healing is limitless. Talk to us about that. What's that mean to you?
Yeah. So, by that, I mean, basically being able to self-regulate or self-modulate. The human body has an incredible ability to self-heal. And we know this is true because if you've ever gotten a bruise or a paper cut and that wound is gone now, then that's just simply proof that your body heals itself. We don't need to really, through visualization or some other means, make our body heal. And not only that, but we couldn't do it if we tried. The body has all of the necessary and sufficient ingredients to be healthy, to be happy, to be harmonious. And we know this state is homeostasis. That's what we call it. So really the modulator there is the nervous system. It's whether we are in that threat response, which is producing inflammation, which is essentially interfering with our body's self-healing mechanisms, or whether we can disengage from that by relaxing, by getting into the zone, by changing our mindset. So when we learn how to self-modulate, that's to say, do these things we're talking about through improving our environment, but also improving how we interrelate with it, how we, respond to it, right? Then that is in a way like accessing this control panel, by which we can kind of grant our brain back the access that it should have to be that chief organizer of all of the cells and systems in the body. We don't have to coordinate all these bodily functions. If we did, it would be exhausting and utterly impossible. There's some 3 trillion reactions taking place in the body per second that need to be taking place in the precise manner that they are in order for us to even be having this conversation and existing. So rather than trying to micromanage, our body, our physical health, even when we learn to actually, back off and drop into that relaxed state, and furthermore, take it to the place where we can be connected, we can be in the flow, we can be productive and doing things and still be in a relaxed state. That is where our true power lies. That's where we can move forward with our true desires, wishes, dreams, while still allowing the body to support its natural healing functions.
And so take us back to that time, though. You said you were ill and bedbound for years. And so you don't just snap your fingers and say, okay, now I know all this stuff. And it's about choosing my mindset, because when you're in the dumps, man, you're like, yeah, whatever. You can tell your mindset, kind of screw off. I know what you're doing here, but you don't understand my situation. It's different. So how did you kind of maybe walk us through step by step, if you will? How did you get out of that to then now have joy and be able to slow down and kind of have that movement and planning and preparation from when you were in the dumps?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I'm glad you brought that up because it certainly didn't happen overnight. And you made a really important distinction, which is the distinction between knowledge or information and then incorporating it and training it and really experiencing it. And, I would argue that we certainly need both. And in some cases, I'd say the precursor is simply knowing a certain thing, like for the neuroplasticity training that I'm involved with now. The very first step is helping people to understand that when they're feeling a certain way, when they're feeling anxious, overwhelmed, burned out, brain fogged, that it's actually not saying anything about them as a person or a human, that it's actually just a neurological process taking place, one that can be regulated and changed. So sometimes the knowledge in and of itself is powerful because it allows us to relax. It allows us to take some of that burden off our own shoulders. So as I was starting to learn this stuff, I was reading books like Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself. And I was listening, to podcasts and to online courses at UC Berkeley in neuroscience. And I was learning about, how the brain could be retrained to do all these kinds of things we're talking about. So the first step was learning.
Which is neuroplasticity, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So neuroplasticity is basically, for those who don't know, is just the brain's ability to adapt to new information. So when we learn a new skill, we're changing the brain. When I was in that, illness, there wasn't much that I could physically do. So the learning itself and following that curiosity already started to alleviate some of the anxiety that was telling me that I was stuck. As I started to learn and hear from other people that had dramatically retrained their brain and regained their health from situations that were even far worse from my own, already that started to have this relaxing effect. But the next step was actually putting it into practice. It's not just about what we know, it's about what we actually practice and embody. And I had this experience that I spoke about. It was the subject of a TED Talk that I gave, became the title of that talk. It's One Deep Breath, where, as I was learning this stuff, but also still really in this place where I was overwhelmed, didn't know how or if I was going to be able to recover. Maybe it was some higher wisdom in me, but some part of my brain or body just took this deep breath in this moment of, otherwise panic. And in that release, in that exhalation, I remember feeling this moment of clarity, this moment of something I hadn't experienced in years up until that point, which was peace. And I started to make that a regular practice, just taking that deep breath, over and over again, several points throughout the day. Whenever I found myself becoming overwhelmed or not knowing how I would get out of this situation, I would just come back to that one simple act. And as I started to go deeper into learning, more about the nervous system and seeing like why that was actually helping me. It did seem to be helping me physically, but also mentally. Some of that brain fog was lifting the more I did this. I learned that you can actually start to recondition. You can retrain your brain from that ongoing threat response to kind of get in that space between stimulus and response. And you can train your body with a new response. So if my, normal learned response that came through the previous experience I had, the illness combined with all of the stress I might have been going through at the time when I got the infection, if that response was to tense my muscles, to grit down deeper, to push harder, to find the solutions, then the new response I was starting to even unconsciously train with that deep breath was, okay, whenever I come up against that tension, instead of, trying to grit my way through it, I'm going to relax. I'm going to really release and let go. And again, by doing that just over and over again, it started to have these pretty profound physical impacts. Yeah. So I started to learn more about how I could foster that, which led to more types of neuroplasticity training exercises. And ultimately took several months to do from there, about 8 months between the time I was still bedbound and before I was back to going back to work. But yeah, it was a profound transformation.
Amazing. So talk to us real quick before we end on Reorigin. Talk to us about that, the anxiety, the physical, the mental health. That's important. I know that's your passion now. And so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Reorigin, came about during pandemic when a friend of mine who had been actually going through a similar experience to what I went through during the time I was going through it, reached out, and we had long been wanting to create a sort of methodology around what had helped us both so much, and but really approach it from a scientific point of view. I think that's something really important in this day and age, is to satisfy that rational part of the mind that's skeptical around new approaches and new ways to alleviate some of these symptoms. So Reorigin is essentially an online program that people can do. There's a website, re-origin.com, that helps teach people how to effectively retrain their own brain and start to calm the nervous system and replenish the body through these types of brain retraining exercises. So anyone experiencing anxiety, burnout, depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, or even post-COVID syndrome, which we're seeing a lot of good results with now, they can check that out and see if this feels like a right fit for them.
That's awesome, man. Well, we'll put that in the show notes for sure. Reorigin.com, re-origin.com.
Correct.
And then where do our listeners find more Ben Ahrens?
Yeah. So best place is, again, on the social medias. That would be reorigin_official for Instagram, or again, probably just best to go to the website, re-origin.com. They can read my bio there and get in touch with me directly through the contact page.
Awesome. We'll put that as well into the show notes, Ben. It's been awesome having you on the Circuit of Success. I think we got a lot in common, man. We got to slow down, get your planning prep sheet here. We got to take that one deep breath. And I can tell you through my work, through meditation and taking that deep breath, it is a game changer for those listening. So I think Ben would agree with that. And it's been awesome having you on the show today, Ben.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brett. Appreciate it.
Tune in next week for another episode of The Circuit of Success with Brett Gilliland on the lineupmedia.fm podcast network. Subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and through our website, circuitofsuccess.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and email any questions to info@circuitofsuccess.com.
This podcast was a presentation of lineupmedia.fm.